Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Worm Whisperer channel, or welcome to if you're new here. Today I've got a good video lined up for everybody. I'm going to go over a storage container for your worm castings. I'm going to go over how to make one. I'm going to go over how the important things that you can do to keep your worm castings healthy for your garden. It may be the middle of the winter or something like that, and you may need to store your worm castings for a few months before you use them in the garden. So I'm going to go over the important points of how to build a worm casting storage container and how to keep your worm castings healthy for harvest. So stay tuned. To get started, I'm going to go over what you need to make this container, or the tools you're going to need and the things that you're going to need. So we're going to go over that first. First thing you're going to need is a container. So I've got a container here. This is the cover we're going to need for the container, and you're going to need a bucket. So this is just a regular bucket you can pick up at any hardware store. So this is what you're going to need to store your worm castings in. Next, you're going to need a drill. Any drill bit would do. Anything from 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch drill bit would be fine for this project, and you're going to need a drill to drill your holes with. Next, you're going to need some pliers, and we'll get into why these are important in a little bit once we get the bin made, and once we get the worm castings, start putting the worm castings in, I'll show you why these are important. And then, of course, lastly, we're going to need some fresh harvested worm castings for your new storage bin. So this is what we're going to put in there, and these are what we're going to store and keep healthy in this bin. Now that we got all our tools here, the first thing we're going to do is drill some holes in the top of this bucket. And what we're going to do is we're going to put these holes in here. And why these are important are when the worm casters are in here, there's going to be a lot of bacteria and a lot of fungi and a lot of microorganisms in this bucket working. And while these guys are working in here, they're going to be off-gassing. And what happens is you're going to want that off-gas to leave the bin. So we're going to go in here and we're going to put a bunch of holes in the top of this, and that's going to allow those microorganisms to off-gas in this container. Okay, so we got our drill. Alright, so we've got holes in here now. I've got a smaller drill bit, so of course I drilled more holes in here. If you have a little bigger drill bit, like a 1/2 inch or something like that, you're going to want to, you can put fewer holes in here. You don't have to put this many, but where I've got a smaller drill bit, I want to drill that many in here. That's going to allow for a good off-gassing of all the microorganisms and allow oxygen exchange in this bin. Now that we have the holes in the top of this thing, we're going to put some holes in the side of this bucket. So we're going to take the top off here, and we're going to put some holes around the top of this bucket. So around here, we're going to put a set of holes all around just underneath this lip here. And the purpose for these holes is, in order to off-gas, you want to be able to have the air to be able to move through. So what these intake holes here are going to do are exactly that. They're going to intake oxygen around here and then move up to pull the gas out through the top of your bin through the holes that we made in the top. Okay, so we're going to put some holes all through and around this. So I usually just put like a set right around the top here. Alright, so as you can see now, we've got some holes all on the top here. So these are going to allow oxygen to come in here. So it'll pull up through, the oxygen will come in here and pull up through and release out the top of the bin, or the top of the bucket. Next is a very important part to making our bin. I see a lot of videos I've watched on YouTube and a lot of articles I've read, and they're missing this important step. And I think this is one of the most important steps when you're making a worm casting storage container. Definitely something that you want to do when you're making one of these, and I see a lot of people, they don't do it, is you want to go to the bottom of the bin and you want to put some holes in the bottom of this. And the reason for that is that if you don't have any holes for drainage in the bottom, if you've got any kind of moisture in your worm castings, you're going to have an issue where the water is going to sink to the bottom of your storage container. It's going to sit there, and what's going to happen is that can go anaerobic, meaning without air. And once that happens, you're going to get a lot of bacteria and a lot of fungus in there that you don't want, or you don't want in your worm storage container. So you're going to end up with a lot of that in your storage container, and you don't want water in the bottom. So you're going to put holes in here, and what that's going to do is allow for drainage in the bottom. So any moisture that wicks to the bottom of your storage container is going to wick out the bottom. So you're not going to end up with a lot of stagnant sitting water or moisture in the bottom of your bin. Okay, so we're going to do that now. We're going to put a few holes in here. Don't need too many in the bottom, just a few, just enough to let the water. I like to usually put a line around the outside here. So I'm just going to put a little line of holes here. Okay, so that's enough holes in the bottom. You don't need a whole lot, just enough to let the water drip through. That'll finish up our bucket, so that's a pretty straightforward deal. You just drill holes in the bucket. It's just important where you're drilling them. We're going to flip this bucket over, and so now our bucket is ready to go. So we've got our holes in the top, our holes in our sides, and some wicking holes in the bottom. This is the part where the flyers come in handy. So what I'm going to do is I take some old flyers here that came, and we're going to take a bunch of these flyers out. This is another important step in keeping your worm castings healthy and keeping them from going anaerobic. So what I like to do is I like to take some of these flyers and I like to set them in the bottom of my storage container. So if you see there, we're going to set them in the bottom of the storage container here. And what these are important to do is the same thing kind of like the holes, only these are going to wick that water up in the bottom of your storage container. So any moisture that's going to soak down to the bottom is going to end up hopefully soaking up in these and keeping the bottom. The most important thing when you're storing worm castings is to keep the bottom from getting too wet or moist and then becoming anaerobic. That's going to be a real challenge. And once that happens, it kind of ruins your worm castings. So you don't want that to happen. So adding these flyers in the bottom here is just another way to make sure that's not going to happen in your worm casting container. Okay, so we just got a nice layer of flyers in the bottom there. So if you notice, I don't put any water or I don't moisten these flyers, and that's important too because you want the moisture to come from the moist worm castings. If there's any moisture in your worm castings and it goes to the bottom here, you want that to be wicked up. So you don't want any water to these flyers in particular on the bottom. Now we're ready for the fun part. So now we're going to add our worm castings to this bucket. So our bucket is basically ready now for worm castings and for our storage. So we're going to add our worm castings. So we've got a whole bunch of nice worm castings here that was just harvested. So we've got here, and if you can see there, look, there's a worm in there. So another thing what will happen is you do have some worms that you didn't catch out of this when you were separating them from the worm castings, is that newspaper at the bottom will actually provide a food for the worms that are still in there that you may have missed. So you can either take them out, or if you don't see them, they're still going to be in there, so they'll have a food source to keep your worm castings healthy and still have a little bit to eat until you use them in your garden. So we're going to add those now. Take that little guy out and I'll add him back to the bin. Set him over there. Okay, so we're going to dump the worm castings in here. So we've got lots of nice healthy worm castings that we can add in. So we're just going to dump the bag in there. So as you can kind of see in there, my worm castings are a little bit damp. These are at the bottom of the bins, so they're always a little damper than the top or the middle bins. So the water already has wick kind of down to the bottom in the bag after they were harvested. So you can just set them in there and just kind of stir them up a little bit. So now that our worm castings are in there, lastly, what we're going to do is we're going to add some more flyers to the top of this. And this is to keep the moisture in. So you have two options here when you put these top flyers in. You can, depending on how wet your worm castings are, mine are really damp, so I'm not going to bother doing this. But if you want to, you can wet this down. So if your worm castings are extra dry, you can wet this flyers or your newspaper down or your cardboard that you're going to put in here. And you can wet that down. And what that will do, if your castings are a little bit dry, that'll keep them moist, and it'll also keep the moisture in. I'm not going to do that because my castings are already a little bit wet anyway. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take it and I'm going to set it in. So this will help keep the moisture in your castings. So if you're not going to use these for 2 or 3 months, they can dry out, and you don't want that. That's not good for the bacteria that are living in there and still breaking these down for nutrients for your plants. So you don't want them to dry out. That's a very important thing as well, is don't let them dry out. So I'm going to put these flyers in here and I'm going to kind of push them down in there. You can see in here. And that's going to hold the moisture in my worm castings and also provide food once again if there's any worms or hatchlings that end up in here before I get them in the garden. Okay, so that's basically all the worm castings are in there. You have your bucket, you have your airflow. That's how you want to set up a nice storage bin to save your worm castings once they're harvested. It's very important to keep them healthy and active with bacteria before you get them into your garden or into your plant pots. To finish off, we're going to add on our cover with our holes in it, and we're going to clamp that down to hold our castings in there. So you hit it around the side a little bit. This one doesn't fit the greatest. All right. Okay, so that finishes it up. So we have our worm casting container and we have our worm castings in there and they're good to go. These will last 4 to 6 months if you want to leave them in here like this. Just keep an eye on them. Maybe after 3 months, give them a check. Just make sure everything's all right in here. If you haven't used them by then, I usually use mine within a month to 2 months, so I don't need to leave mine in here any longer than that. But if you do, you can just keep an eye on them. Just make sure that they're staying moist and that they look nice and healthy and that there's no smell coming off them. And everything should be good to add these to your garden when you're ready for them. All right, so that wraps up our video for today. Thank you guys all for joining me. I hope you learned how to store your worm castings and make a worm casting container today. If you did, thank you for watching, and I hope that you'll like and subscribe to this video to support the channel. I appreciate everybody who's supporting the channel. I hope that you guys all have a great day. Happy worm farming as always, and I'll see you next time. See you later.